and welcome to Western Civ, episode 179, Late Medieval Religion. The discovery of the New World profoundly changed the history of the Western world. Yet if you ask someone living in, say, 1520, 1530, which was more important, I firmly believe most people probably would have said the ongoing religious controversy that today we call the Reformation. The discovery of the Americas would prove to be massively important in time. But in the early 16th century, said discovery really honestly didn't impact many Europeans, thinking percentage-wise. The vast majority of Europeans in the 16th century did not travel to the New World, obviously, nor did most see any major change to their life or their way of life, their lifestyle. They would, don't get me wrong, but those changes were still a century or maybe a little bit more away. The Reformation, though, on the other hand, would have an immediate and dramatic impact on the lives of millions of Europeans. Whether you lived in the German states and experienced the 30 Years' War, in Italy, where the Counter-Reformation was studiously planned, or in England, which changed sides about every 10 minutes or so for a bit there, the Reformation played a major role in your life. And I think this is so important for this episode, and one of the reasons that I'm doing it, I don't think it's fair for us to assume that everyone who made decisions during the Reformation did so for non-religious reasons. Sure, let's be honest. Did Henry VIII have a vested and passionate interest in the question of transubstantiation? Probably not. He just wanted his divorce. But many Europeans, great nobles and normal peasants, were profoundly religious. And for them, this stuff, and by this stuff I mean how the church impacted them on a day-to-day basis, that sort of thing, that really mattered. And I don't think that we can overlook that. Thus, today's episode. So what we're going to do, in a nutshell, in these 3 or 4 introductory episodes to the Reformation is I want to take a look at medieval religion. And what I want to do is look at it from 2 standpoints. Historical and chronological, which is what we'll get into more in the next 3 episodes, when we look at sort of the church from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to roughly the early 14th century, then the Avignon papacy, followed by the Renaissance popes, the popes who, if we're being honest, if the Reformation was coming, they were beating the proverbial dead horse at that point. But today, what I really want to do is take a hard look at medieval religion, especially late medieval religion, by which I do mean Catholicism, obviously. How did medieval Christianity impact people on a daily basis? How did it influence the development of society and culture between 400 and 1400 CE? And how did it change during that same period? Believe it or not, by the way, most of the aspects of Christianity that we still follow today as dogma were established between roughly 1000 and 1600 CE. Not as many would expect at the time of Christ. There's a huge difference. And we're not honestly in the show right now. We're not even going to talk about early Christianity. Early Christianity, which can be defined loosely as Christianity between the death of Christ, let's say, and the adoption of Constantine of Christianity as an acceptable, not state, acceptable religion. That's really early Christianity. That's a totally different thing. It really is. Because we're talking about pre-St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, and we're going to talk about him a lot in this show, to be fair, influences the development of early Christian and medieval Christian theology just as much as any one of the 12 apostles. You might argue just as much as Jesus Christ. It's really him and another guy that we'll talk about later on, Thomas Aquinas, who give us the Christianity that we have today. For many, that's going to be a surprise, and I'll give my usual religion caveat here that this is not a religious podcast. I'm not here to argue individual people's individual beliefs. That's up to you. I'm just giving you the history. Who did what and when. That's the sort of baseline historiography that we should all understand. But today, we need to take a hard look at this period, talking about the medieval period from roughly 400 to 1400, to better understand the changes that the Reformation would bring and how those changes would impact the common European. We're going to start with an overview of church organization and structure. That way it's going to be easier to understand in what ways common people during the Middle Ages interacted with the church, which was obviously the most important institution in Europe at the time. The basic unit of the church was the parish, which was oftentimes the same thing as the manor, served by the priest. The priest was often the son of a manor lord, who knew intimately whom he served and vice versa. He was directly responsible for the spiritual welfare of the people in the parish, which was geographically defined in this case. He administered the sacraments except for ordination and confirmation. Those were reserved for the bishop. His education was normally shallow and was simply derived from another parish priest or sometimes, if he was lucky, a monastery nearby. Candidates for the priesthood sometimes lived in the bishop's home during their preparation, as in the case of the early church. In later years, the study of theology would become available in northern universities, but honestly, that wasn't readily available for most parish priests and should be discounted as a rule. Seminaries, as we know them today, did not exist until the 16th century. The priest's duties were to say Mass, visit the sick, teach the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and if able, to give boys, and sadly just boys, a rudimentary instruction in letters. The age for the orders in the Middle Ages was fixed at 30 for the priesthood, 25 as a deaconate, and 20 for a subdeaconate. Priests who lived in towns enjoyed a greater variety of service and opportunities for advancement. In larger churches, several priests would live in a semi-monastic community according to a rule canon, that's a word we'll come back to later. Priests who served in large urban churches were supported by endowments of income-producing lands. Some canons abused this system in the late Middle Ages, when they went about just sort of collecting all the income-producing lands, and from which income they hired different sub-vicars to fulfill their duties. So basically, what they were doing in the late Middle Ages was the modern equivalent of outsourcing. Well, I don't really want to go to that parish. I just want the income. Well, how much income is it? £50 a year? All right, well, I'll give some schlep £30 a year. He can go there. I'll pocket the 20. I don't have to do anything. Seems like a win-win. It's that sort of scenario that led to regulations. These were enacted to ensure that every priest would spend at least 1/3 of each year in his residence at the parish. The rise of towns and even large cities beginning in the 12th century, together with the emergence of universities, considerably increased opportunities for education and clerical advancement. Parish churches were usually nothing to write home about. A small frame building, but after 1200, stone buildings became into use. The land around the church, including the cemetery, which we'll come back to, was considered sacred, and only those who died in good standing were allowed to be buried in that space. Within the precincts of the church, including the cemetery, all acts of violence were prohibited. And from this, eventually we get the right of sanctuary. That's going to be a problem for Henry II and Thomas Becket. One major difference that I think you would notice right now, if you walked into a medieval church, would be there are no pews. People brought their own chairs, and that was on purpose. And the reason that it was on purpose was because the church could then be used for a variety of functions. Children played inside the interiors. Secular business was conducted. Dances were held in the courtyard. Occasionally one reads of grain being stored and animals being lodged in churches. And this was not considered disrespectful. It was the understanding that God was close and friendly. In the later Middle Ages, this would change a little bit. God would become a little bit more remote, and God's home a place of awe and silence. And separation is going to be a problem when it comes to the Reformation. Now, every parish belonged to a territorial unit governed by a bishop called a diocese. During the period of economic decline, which followed the fall of Rome, it was often the presence of the bishop and his household which alone kept towns alive and continuing to function as administrative centers. Dioceses could vary in size dramatically. There were really small ones in Italy, and there were massive tracts of land, acres upon acres, in northern Europe and England. Bishop's throne, called a cathedral, gave the name cathedral to the church where it was located, usually in the largest town of the diocese. As I indicated, canons were assigned a cathedral, and these formed chapters with an archdeacon as its leader. It was rare for bishops to not experience some conflict with the archdeacon, especially because the archdeacon usually served as judge of the bishop's court. In the early church, bishops were elected by the clergy and the people of the diocese. In later years, cathedral canons gained control of episcopal elections, but the king's consent to elect, called concessio regalis, was required. Because bishops were involved in land holding and secular duties, sometimes including military duties, kings and lay lords had a vested interest in their selection. It's estimated that by about 1100 CE, about 2/3 of the bishops and abbots in France were selected primarily by the lay lords. And this is going to lead to a tension we'll talk about in a little bit called investiture. At his consecration, and as 99% of you already know, only men could be bishops, so I'm going to use he here. The bishop received the symbols of his office: the pastoral staff, the ring, and, after 1100 CE, the mitre, a shield-shaped head dress. The bishop's primary responsibility was the supervision of all the churches, monasteries, revenues, and ecclesiastical justice within the diocese. He was required to conduct visitations to every church or monastery under his care once every 3 years. We do actually possess a number of records of such visitations. According to one Archbishop of Rouen, in February 1248, quote, "We found that the priest of Raville was ill-famed with the wife of a certain stone carver, and by her is said to have had a child. He does not stay in his church. He plays ball, and he rides around in a short coat. The priest of Rebu frequents taverns and drinks to excess. Simon, the priest of Saint Just, is pugnacious and quarrelsome." End quote. So some bishops took these, I guess I'll call them riding circuit duties, rather seriously. On the other hand, in a large city church, the same man discovered that, quote, "the canons talk and chatter from stall to stall and across each other, while the divine office is being celebrated. They hasten through the psalms too quickly," end quote. He also discovered priests who had barely any knowledge of Latin verse. This register of this particular bishop covers 20 years of visitations and is over 700 pages long. But I think all we can assume from this is that this was a rather remarkable bishop, particularly in terms of his conscientious attention and also to his decorum within his jurisdiction. Now, bishops engaged in a multitude of responsibilities. They baptized, they preached, they heard confessions, they aided the poor and oppressed. They founded and supervised welfare agencies and acted as arbitrators. They maintained a court, administered the properties of the diocese, engaged in correspondence, attended church councils, advised the princes, and occasionally wrote theological or devotional treatises. Now, of course, at the pinnacle of the church government stood the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Now, we're going to get a lot more into this in the coming episodes, but theoretically, the claims for papal power were a legacy from the very early church, based primarily on an interpretation of Christ's words to Peter in Matthew 16:13 through 19, that the church was built upon Peter, whose successor the popes claimed to be. During the early Middle Ages, popes were chosen by the clergy and the nobility of Rome, with the agreement of the cardinals and sometimes the assent of the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II changed this procedure to roughly the one that we know today, wherein the Pope is elected by the cardinals. In 1179, this was codified that, quote, "the Pope shall be considered the Roman pontiff, who shall be elected and received by 2/3 of the cardinals," end quote. This remains the policy today, though the final vote is always presented as a unanimous selection through the now ubiquitous white smoke. During the Middle Ages, the popes began expanding their power throughout Europe through the use of the papal legate. Legates were papal ambassadors, assigned to royal courts or sometimes appointed for a specific purpose. For example, each crusade had a papal legate. These men had the authority to act in the Pope's name, subject to his approval. Now, in addition, papal authority was expended through the purse. The church was the principal financial institution in society. Since the time of Gregory the Great, It was the custom that the parish income was to be divided in 4 ways: to the bishop, to the poor, for the upkeep of the church, and for the support of the priest. Since many lay lords controlled churches for the purpose of increasing their own funds, this division of income was never observed. The lower echelons of the church had also 4 main sources of income: tithes, perquisites, donations, and benefices. All Christians were expected to contribute 1/10 of their income to the church, either in money or in kind. This was the tithe, and it was traditionally difficult to collect. Priests went about the parish, gathering whatever they could: grain, animals, cloth, produce, literally anything you can think of, to be stored in what was called the tithe barn. We read of priests who were even beaten or killed as they attempted to gather the tithe. Perquisites were gifts to the church for special pastoral services, which in time actually turned into just fixed charges. Donations were special gifts, prompted obviously by sincere piety. And benefices included all of the properties owned by the church. Bishops and abbots often possessed considerable revenue-producing real estate in addition to all of this. Plus, in addition to all of the gifts of the faithful, the papacy, that is the Pope, received the income from all its estates in Italy. These holdings continued to grow, so that by 1200, the papacy was the feudal lord of 1/3 of Italy. The tax, which became known as Peter's pence, was also contributed annually by the monarchs of England, Poland, Hungary, and the Scandinavian countries. The Pope also received fees for exemptions, the right of monasteries, churches, and religious orders to be free from the jurisdiction of the bishops and come directly under papal supervision. This happened to the monastery at Cluny, the Cistercians, and, as we'll see, unfortunately for them, the Knights Templar. High church officials paid fees for the confirmation of their appointments, and archbishops paid to receive the palum, a circular band of white wool worn on the shoulder, the insignia of their office. In the late Middle Ages, newly consecrated bishops paid the anante, a sum equivalent to 1 year's revenue of their diocese. And that will be something I come back to in future episodes because it's actually very important, so don't forget that. There were also fees for papal documents, charters, and of course, because justice ain't free in the papal world, for the use of the papal courts. The lowest of these church courts was that of the dean. The dean was a priest who would exercise jurisdiction over an area roughly the size of a county. He held a monthly court called a calends. Next highest court was that of the bishop, from which appeals could be made to the papal court. Church courts exercised concurrent jurisdiction with lay courts. The church courts were more popular, however, because they tended to be more lenient. The church, when considering an offense, took motivations and mitigating circumstances into consideration, while the local lord's court normally did not. It was from the medieval court that the practice of assessing crimes in terms of degrees came into being. A central feature of church organization was the council, a deliberative assembly of the clergy or bishops, convened either at regular intervals or for a specific task to address the needs of the church. The most significant of these assemblies were those designated as ecumenical, which meant that their decisions were accepted by both East and West, so by the Eastern Orthodox Church and by the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Today, only the first 7 of these councils are recognized as ecumenical, as universal. Beginning with the First Council of Nicaea in 325, and ending with the Seventh and Second Council of Nicaea in 787. All of these, interestingly enough, were held in the East. All were convened by the emperor and attended by the 5 patriarchs of Christendom: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. After the schism between the East and the West, which was 1054, we'll talk about that more next episode, the Latin Church continued to hold councils, which the West considered ecumenical, but which were never recognized by the Eastern Greek Orthodox. As a result, 4 medieval gatherings were called Lateran councils, named after the papal palace where they were held. And these met in 1123, 1139, 1179, and, crucially, 1215. In addition, there were 4 other councils in the late Middle Ages, which were considered ecumenical in the West. Lyon in 1245, which excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, for what that's worth. Lyon again in 1274, which affected a temporary reunion with the East. Vienne in 1311, which condemned the Knights Templar. We'll talk a lot about that when we get to the Avignon papacy in a little bit. And then 1114, 1118, which called for a reform of the clergy. And also kind of almost gives you an image of what's going to happen in the Reformation. All right, so now that we have the basic organization out of the way, what would a church service in the Middle Ages look like? First, let's consider what a large service would have resembled. One where, let's say, maybe a bishop would have been presiding. Inside the church, men and women were divided, men on one side, women on the other. Candles were lit on 7 candlesticks, and the procession began, led by a thurifer with incense, followed by assisting clergy, with the presider coming last. Meanwhile, the choir would be singing. All the while, the bishop would enter, facing eastward, during Gloria in Excelsis, followed by the greeting, Peace be to you, after which he would have prepared the collect or prayer of the day. Readings from the Bible, either from the New or Old Testament, by a subdeacon, followed by which a singer responded with the psalm verse, gradual or maybe Alleluia. A deacon, after receiving the blessing, read the gospel, accompanied with candles and incense. There is no mention early on of a sermon. Sermons actually fell out of use in the 9th and 10th centuries and were only restored in the 12th. Neither was there a creed, which did not enter the liturgy until the 11th century. This ended the service of the Word. In ancient times, the catechisms, those not yet baptized, were dismissed, but by 800, almost all adults had been baptized as infants, and there was no dismissal. The offertory procession then began with the service of the Eucharist. But the offerings of the bread and wine were permitted, which were gathered as the choir sang the offertory psalm. Those who received these offerings washed their hands, including, interestingly, all the way up to the Pope. The liturgy then followed, and this has actually remained relatively consistent, frankly, and was consistent throughout the Middle Ages between the East and the West Church, with the Lord be with you, and also with you. Lift up your hearts. We have lifted them up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right to give thanks. There followed the consecration of bread and wine and the use of the Eucharistic prayer. But as of yet, there were no genuine flexions or elevations. These would not be added until 1200. In the West, the moment of consecration was believed to be the recitation of Christ's words, of institution. In the East, the crucial action was the prayer for the Holy Spirit. This prayer came to be recited in an inaudible whisper by the priest, further accentuating the mystery, but also, at the same time, contributing to the further alienation of the people. The Lord's Prayer followed the prayer for consecration, in the belief that, quote, "Give us this day our daily bread," referred to the Eucharist. By 1200, regular unleavened bread was no longer in use, being replaced by wafers similar to those in many churches today. Whether people came forward to the altar to receive communion or were served in the nave is not clear, but they did receive both the bread and the wine. That was one of the major concerns of the Hussites, as many of my patrons will recall from that episode. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 stipulated that all Christians must commune at least once per year, and that at Easter. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Mass was far more a priestly ceremony, in which the laity were present, and being in Latin, was unintelligible to most people. The Mass ended, as it does much today, with the "Go, the Mass is ended," and the people responding, "Thanks be to God." Now, the average parish church was served by a single priest. The Mass was reduced, in these cases, to its most bare essentials: readings from the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, the consecration of the bread and the wine, the communion, and the dismissal. Certainly, everyone, by and large, attended Mass on Sunday. Most Europeans, though, looked for the reassurances of religion at the central events of life: birth, death, and marriage. And we're going to look more closely at each of those in just a moment. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, in terms of baptism, by 1200, the vast majority of baptisms were infants. The majority of adult Europeans, though not all, were members of the church already. The age of proselytizing, the age of missionaries going east and west, by the 13th century, by and large, I'm not saying exclusively, but generally that was over. Now, in addition to the normal affairs of the church, saint worship was immensely popular during the Middle Ages, especially the late and high Middle Ages. Now, that being said, the veneration of saints does go all the way back to the Christian martyrs of the 2nd century. Early on, local bishops could and did canonize saints on their own. But by the 10th century, the Pope had taken over that process. According to the teachings of the Church, the saints reigned together with Christ and offered their prayers to God on the behalf of humankind. In this, they served as intermediaries, and in the course of time, several saints gained specialities. Sailors and fishermen, for example, addressed their prayers to St. Nicholas. St. Genevieve cured fever. St. Blaise relieved toothache. St. Hubert, he was the guard against madness. Because of the multiplication of saints, the special feast day of All Saints' Day on November the 1st was inaugurated in the 5th century to commemorate everybody. Veneration of saints was defended as the integral doctrine of the Church and of salvation. Many claim still that Christ was the only mediator, but others believed in the intercession of the saints, and especially in the concept that their merits could be applied to other believers, living and dead. It was Alexander Halis, who died in 1245, who first defined the quote-unquote treasury of merit as a treasury of spiritual merits accumulated from the abundant merits of Christ and the saints, which suffice to pay the spiritual debts of the living. It crucially, and this is key, was from this idea, this concept, this treasury, that the medieval church was able to sell and grant indulgences, the remission of temporal punishment for sins. You see, because the idea was that because the saints had been so good, they left behind this excess good, this treasury of good, this plus of good, and that we could all tap into it. And that the Pope, because the Pope was the successor to St. Peter, the Pope could dole it out, if for a price. Of course, the most favored saint of all was the Virgin Mary, though one debate that raged throughout the Middle Ages was whether or not she should be considered sinless, that is, preserved from the stain of original sin, childbirth. This is the concept that comes down today known as the Immaculate Conception. Ultimately, it became church policy that Mary was, in fact, sinless, a policy that was declared dogma in 1854. Most lay people interacted with the saints through the relics held at different locations, though those relics were not considered themselves to have the magical powers. It was the saint, or often the saint through God, who worked the miracles, not the actual cross or, crown of thorns or saint somebody's shoe. The church calendar of saints and feast days dominated the political calendar of Europe. Parliament in England, for example, met at Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, all around the church calendar. One factor about medieval religion that is of crucial importance to us here is the fact that most people were illiterate, and so their knowledge of the Bible came through secondary sources. Secondary sources that, by and large, the Catholic Church controlled. It was only in the 12th century that some lay reading of the Bible was revived, which died off again in the myriad crises of the 13th and 14th centuries, and was revived with a passion with the invention of the printing presses in the 15th and 16th centuries. The crisis of Scripture became a major theological issue from the 14th century on, as we'll see here in this series. Now, one thing that we absolutely cannot overlook when thinking about people's relationship to the church is that the church in the Middle Ages was intimately involved in the feudal structure of Europe. Both the church in general and the clergy personally owned large tracts of land and were therefore lords under the feudal system. Each holding carried with it various obligations of rent or service to the vassals or peasants who lived on that land. And in this way, the church became intimately intertwined with the economic and political system of medieval Europe. Entire towns, forests, roadways, waterways, fairs, and other economic assets could be under the supervision of a church, bishop, or monastery. It wasn't even unusual for a count/bishop to lead an army, which could include clergy/knights. And so it was kind of under these conditions that the only unifying institution in society to which most, if not everyone, professed some form of loyalty was the church. Christianity became the glue that held this crazy feudal system of Europe together. I mean, you can't forget for a second just how violent feudal society was. The church tried to offer the only real form of respite for most medieval Europeans. At the Synod of Clairvaux in 989, it was decreed that common people, peasants, the poor, should be spared in times of hostilities, and that cattle stealing was condemned. This was known as the Peace and Truce of God, and its goal was to spare the defenseless from harm. But crucially, it did not condemn warfare. In 1027, Another council prohibited attack on enemies from the 9th hour on Saturday until the 1st hour on Monday, out of respect for Sundays. In other words, the church at this point is trying to carve out some peaceful times for the normal people of Europe. It also prohibited attacks on unarmed priests and monks, or anyone going to or coming from a church, or anyone in female company, or on church buildings or other structure within 45 meters of a church. And I think sometimes society's laws, unfortunately, reveal the problems that they have. If you have to make a law that says that you're not allowed to attack an unarmed monk on his way to church service, you've got problems. Eventually, the peace and truce of God system was extended in time to prohibit warfare from Wednesdays to Monday mornings. So basically, you can fight on Mondays and Tuesdays, all of Advent and all of Lent. These attempts to curb violence in Europe during the medieval period probably failed just as often, if not more often, than they succeeded. But again, it's important to recognize, and I keep coming back to this over and over and over again, that because of how intertwined with society the church was, different people could have a lot of different complaints when it came to how the church functioned. And it was very easy to then, as we turn towards the Reformation, for different individuals to criticize and blame the church for doing things that, according to the scriptures, the church had no business in doing. Many will point out, did not Christ say, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's? What business is it of the church then, some will ask, in trying to run fairs, in trying to manage feudal obligations? The church becomes, in essence, the only corporation in the Western medieval world. And as we turn towards the Avignon papacy and the Renaissance popes, what we'll find is that this corporation doesn't have a very good complaints department. Now, another main sticking point as we talk about the structure of the church is celibacy. Because celibacy was not an original requirement, at least for priests. Some of the fathers of the original church, Gregory of Nyssa, for example, were married, and his own father had been a priest. In fact, in some churches, there was a place of honor reserved for the priest's wife. At the original Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, some people tried to speak up, arguing that priests should be celibate, but it was defeated overwhelmingly. In the 9th and 10th centuries, a large percentage of the clergy were still married. Now, at the same time, attempts continued to come up to realize the ideal of clerical celibacy. Now, in part, what we have going on here is the huge impact of monasticism on the church. Monks and monastic rites were starting to be seen as more pure than the priests. So in an effort to try to combat this with reform, the argument starts to become, well, priests need to be more like monks, and monks are celibate. But while ideals are all well and good, let's be honest, the real impetus for Gregorian reform under especially Hildebrand, Gregory, were economics. Because the church was part of the feudal structure, and because of primogeniture, if a priest was married and had a son, then the feudal land simply passed on to the son. But that didn't work for the corporate structure of the church. The church wanted to take the land back, pass it on to somebody else, dole it out for a different favor. Also, because as we know, that land and the titles that come with it can be sold over and over and over again. If it just gets passed on to the son, then the church doesn't get to keep making money off of the sale. And as we get later and later and later, there's an absolute obsession within the church of making money. And so priests become celibate because we don't want their sons inheriting the property. So with the formal structure of the church now in hand, we're going to turn the rest of our attention in this episode to the most important rites of the church, because that's how individuals, when you think of the church from a spiritual standpoint, that's how individuals would have most of their interactions. So of course, what I'm really talking about is baptism, death, marriage, etc. We need to go through those to understand how regular people interacted with and understood church theology in the centuries that led up to the Reformation. For the rest of the episode, I'm really focusing on Christianity from the year 1400 on. It's really an appropriate year to begin our study of theology, because 1400 to roughly 1525, that's the period when everything starts changing and people really start to question the theology of the church. Of course, this was also a period, as we're going to get into in the next few episodes, of incredible, tumultuous animosity in the church. There are two popes going on right now. There's a schism in Avignon. We're dealing still with the aftermath of the Black Plague. There's division, hatred, conflict. Don't forget, the 100 Years' War is still rolling on. And interestingly enough, the year 1400 is a useful year because back in 1300, Pope Boniface VIII had inaugurated what was called the Jubilee. So every 100 years, there's supposed to be this mass pilgrimage to Rome. Now, in 1390, when you would have expected the announcement to come forward for the expected Jubilee, as I mentioned, the papacy is in complete turmoil and tatters. They don't make any such announcement. What's fascinating is thousands and thousands of people come anyway. What this suggests is, at this point, people aren't looking to the Pope as the absolute spiritual authority. They're not asking for permission to come. They're not asking the church fathers. They know who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and that is Christ. Now let's begin by talking about the theory of salvation, because obviously that's important to the way that normal people would have looked and understood their relationship to the church. The church theologians have been working on that, which had been developed by St. Anselm of Canterbury roughly 3 centuries prior, so around 1100. The theory of salvation goes like this in basic terms. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve disobeyed God. In doing so, they erected between God and themselves a wall, call it a state of offense. This wall, then, required that Adam and Eve be kicked out of the garden immediately. However, God has to be perfectly just. Huge concept. Therefore, God, because he is perfectly just, could not remove the wall, the state of the offense, until a compensation, and a fair compensation, had been paid. He can't do it out of his own goodwill. And I'm going to use he, by the way, here as the pronoun to discuss God, because if you look at all of the contemporary sources, obviously, God is referred to using the masculine pronoun. I'm not suggesting that as my own theological opinion. I'm simply delivering up to you what the contemporaries would have said. So if we look then, man owes a debt of restitution to God. Otherwise, the state of the offense can't go away. But herein lies the problem, because God is, well, God, and man is so much lesser, the logic went, that man was unable to make just satisfaction, meaning that the wall of offense between God and man could not be removed. Only according to Anselm could one who is both God and man make said satisfaction and redeem mankind. Enter stage left, Christ, the necessary intermediary. Christ was both God and man. Christ, upon his death, had no need of the compensation that his death provided. So instead, he begged his Father God that the price he paid be transferred to mankind. God, because he was perfectly just, he has to be perfectly just because it's God, he would not able to refuse his Son. So man, through Jesus Christ, was finally able to make satisfaction and restore the state of peace between God and man. Now, there are a few ideas at play here that medieval theologians really latched onto. First, there is this notion of compensation. These medieval thinkers took it for granted that offenses between two parties can only be corrected by a state of retributive compensation in equal weight, and that is the key to the weight of the offense committed. The most important concept here, though, is the idea that by undergoing a painful experience, the party that does that acquires a sort of credit in their moral currency bank account, and that this moral credit can be transferred to a third party. This idea was the linchpin in the argument that Christ could redeem mankind, even though Christ had obviously committed no sin against God. Christ was still allowed to transfer his moral credit, which was huge, to mankind. As we'll see later on, this leap in logic provides us the bridge that the church needs to get the theological justification for indulgences. Interestingly, the medieval Irish took this whole idea to an extreme and developed the custom of fasting against one's enemies. The idea was to put oneself deliberately through pain, and as a result, acquire a moral currency that can be used against somebody. And no, I don't know if it works. But that doesn't get us all the way. As I said, there are two axioms that Anselm needed to make his salvation argument. The second is the notion of kinship. This idea is that you inherit the sins of those related to you who came before you. But the same holds true about redemption. You are allowed to substitute yourself and your satisfaction for an offense created by someone related to you who came before you, as long as the satisfaction was meritorious enough. So, by way of example, what the medieval theologians were saying is that if your father committed an offense against another family, you were allowed, even though you didn't commit the offense, you were allowed to make satisfaction for that offense, as long as whatever the satisfaction was in equal weight. Concept of equal weight being extremely important. So this then is how medieval theologians get to the idea that we call, and they called, original sin. The sin of Adam and Eve transfers to each one of us because, so the theory goes, we are all related to them. But Christ's satisfaction is enough because it's so massive to pay for all of us in perpetuity. All in all, what Anselm wanted to do was put together a theory that would pass the theological muster and be persuasive to the common man. To a large extent, he seems to have been successful. Everyone accepted the doctrine of original sin and redemption. Now, in Anselm's reading, the Redeemer is Christ, the man, not Christ, the God. Godhead, as it was called, is a sort of quantity of godness with which Christ operates. This is the famous double nature of Christ, as understood by medieval Europeans for whom Christ was simply God. And also, of course, was the source of centuries of bloodshed and conflict as the early medieval church fought back and forth over what the true understanding of Christ's nature was. But the key for Anselm is that Christ the Redeemer had to be Christ the man, because otherwise they're not kin, and mankind could not reap the blessing of the sacrifice. Now, I want to pause here and remind everybody that's listening that these are ideas that did not take hold until at least the 11th century. That is around 1,000 years after the life of Christ. These are not ideas that would have been expressed by the first Christians. These ideas are purely medieval. So when the Reformation starts, remember, it's not that Martin Luther is going to dispute the text of the Bible. He's going to dispute its medieval interpretation. As a result of Anselm and these twin theories, the crucifix, not the cross, in the Middle Ages, was the major image of the redemption. Moreover, if you were to go back to the Middle Ages, especially the High Middle Ages, it was Good Friday that was perhaps the most important of all the church holidays, the day of the sacrifice, the day of the payment of the debt. And it still takes on importance that the Catholic Church gives it today. Before then, all the focus was on Easter itself. So really, Easter was the major holiday until you get to about 1000 CE. And then Good Friday starts to pick up steam. By 1400, the idea of Christ's sufferings, of the payment of the debt, had become a major theme in all church services. Again, huge distinction between the church in the High Middle Ages and the church in the early Middle Ages. By comparison, Christmas, though a day of great feasting, was a far cry from Easter week in terms of importance during the Middle Ages. Christmas was more of a season than a day. But even so, considering it's a whole season, it was still a good deal less popular than Good Friday during the Middle Ages. If anyone was celebrated during the Christmas season, it was probably the Virgin Mary. Of Christ's kin, certainly Mary was considered the nearest. She was the first member of a redeemed human race. The doctrine of Mary's Immaculate Conception, whereby she is liberated from the sin of conception, yes, that was a sin, we'll talk about it, had also been envisioned by St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, and would be taken up by the Franciscans in time. Of course, for those of you that know, because the Franciscans liked it, that meant the Dominicans opposed it. But whatever, we don't have time for Capulet Montague stuff right now. The Immaculate Conception was given its own feast day by Pope Sixtus IV during the 15th century. But again, remember, what's being venerated here is not the birth of Christ. It's the miracle of the Immaculate Conception. That's what everybody's celebrating, not Christmas. Next after Mary in terms of Christ's kin was St. Anne, Mary's mother, interestingly. St. Anne was venerated enormously, particularly during the 16th century and in her own right. Now, a lot of you might have expected, well, what about Joseph? Shouldn't he have a place of honor? But you would, until the late 16th century, be dead wrong. In fact, up until that point, no one really cared a lick for Joseph. He might be Mary's husband after all, but he was not Christ's father. By 1500, his cult was finally starting to gain some steam through the Carpenters' Guild and society at large. And by the eve of the Reformation, the new trinity of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had come to replace the old one, Mary, Jesus, and St. Anne. Now then, of course, we have to talk about the medieval understanding of the saints. Chief among those are the apostles, half of which were Christ's relatives anyway, so clearly they're close in terms of kinship. Saints might not all be relatives, but they were certainly the friends of Christ and God. Friendship with God, after all, was meant to be demonstrated by showing friendship among men. Now, friendship was not quid pro quo. Saints might show favor, but never because of merit, just simply out of friendship. Of course, as I mentioned before, all saints would get their due on All Saints' Day, every November 1st. Obviously, the first rite of passage into the Christian church was baptism. So in the baptism, in the medieval period, there were two distinct parts to the ritual. One, most of us would recognize quite easily. The other one looks as alien as something that would be in a horror film. The first part of the baptism actually takes place outside of the church during the medieval period and is called the exorcism. The exorcism is when the priest calls on the redemptive power bequeathed by Christ to his church to expel the devil from the child, shattering any grasp he acquired over man at the fall and maintaining it from generation to generation. The priest would hold the child and say, quote, "I exorcise thee, unclean spirit, accursed one, damned and to be damned." The language of this rite was incomprehensible to the ordinary man, but it nevertheless inspired a general opinion that the state of the original sin was akin to one that is bewitched, whence the child is freed and set clean. After the exorcism, the child was carried within the church, where he could be either dipped in the water or have water sprinkled on her forehead. While there seems to have been a preference for the more dramatic dipping method, the latter seems to have been much more common. One of the most important considerations prior to the baptism, certainly by the late Middle Ages, was who would be the godparents. Godparents are something that it's hard for us to understand today, but were of crucial importance in the Middle Ages. In terms of theology, the idea itself was highly symbolic. The godparent was to be the child's new family on the other side of death, once the trappings of the real world, i.e. flesh and blood, were stripped away. In the real world, the relationship of godparent to the child was called cum paternitas, and within this relationship, the child and the child's family became kin to the godparent. This is a very important idea to understand, because then the church went ahead and forbade marriages, not just between those who were related by blood, but also godparents, anyone related through cum paternitas. The baptism ritual would end with the baptismal feast, wherein the godparents often brought the most lavish gifts. These gifts were very important because the giving of gifts also created relationships between people in Western Europe. So the gifts themselves were designed to cement the spiritual relationship. Said godparents were also given the most important places at the baptismal feast. Now, in taking a dim view of baptismal gifts, the church seems to have been supposing that the choice of godparent would be dominated by the secular considerations of advancement of the children. And historians have often placed godparenthood next to many other types of patronage characteristic of the late medieval West. Now, that may be true for the nobility. In terms of the nobility, it was extremely common to search out a godparent who could provide later financial assistance, political assistance for the child and for the family in general. However, in terms of 99.9% of the population of Europe, the choice of godparents was a purely egalitarian situation. And again, this is why it's so important to remember that real religion really did matter, and it mattered a lot to the people of the late medieval ages and the people who were going to form the bedrock of the Reformation. For most people in Europe, who the godparent was had nothing to do with financial assistance that they might provide. The question was to find a good model, a good Christian model, and someone who could provide for the child after death and could be the new family of the child after death. These were real things, not simply phrases that somebody mumbled but didn't know the meaning of. Now, it was not in the practice in the early or high Middle Ages to name the child at the baptism. The priest might inquire as to the child's name, but it was assumed that they already had one. However, once naming became a major part of the ceremony, around 1400, the clergy was quick to intervene in the naming, often making sure that a saint's name was included as a first or middle name. By the Reformation, the use of the saint's name was ubiquitous. Marriage was likewise a serious matter, as it was tied to the age-old concerns of sexuality and inheritance. There was also here an existing corpus of law, Roman, Germanic, and Celtic, whose relationship to Christianity was debatable, but whose influence over marriage was nonetheless strong. The Church did, of course, weigh in on marriage. Since 1215, the Church banned marriages of anyone related within 4 degrees of blood or via godparentage. While medieval Europeans might have argued that a marriage within the family would be the most logical and efficient way of keeping land and wealth within the family, the Church disagreed. St. Augustine, in fact, going back to the 5th century, had argued for marriage outside the bonds of normal filial structures, on the basis that said marriages would strengthen ties within the Christian community and reduce infighting. For most people, the celebration of new kinship brought about by marriage was solemnized by a feast. But in most regions of Christendom, the marriage took place, like the first part of the baptismal rite, at the church door. In German lands, commonly at a special door, constructed in the side of the church for just the purpose of marriage. Standing upon the threshold, the priest was not enacting or administering a sacrament, but verifying the proper conduct of a social operation, which embodied much profane matter but was nonetheless Christian, and indeed sacramental without his presence. Now, the central rite of the spouses consisted of an exchange in which the father or friends of the bride gave her to the groom, in exchange for a symbolic countergift. This formula of objective exchange in England, which was called a wedding because the gift actually in England was called the wed, had both Roman and German ancestors. Now later on, this changed fairly dramatically. Eventually, the priest would take the place of the father of the groom. The wife-buying aspect was toned down to an antique bride wealth. It was kind of a gift to the father of the bride. And this evolved into a modern dowry. Nevertheless, the steadfast gift-counter-gift structure, which is, of course, in its nature an alliance-building concept, remains in place throughout the Reformation. Once inside the church, what would be followed would be a nuptial mass. Certainly only a priest could say a nuptial mass, but this was an optional extra for most medieval Europeans, outside of Spain for some reason, where it seems to have been the norm. Now, that being said, from 1400 to 1600, the involvement of the clergy at all stages of the marriage became more and more prevalent. And there were 2 main reasons for this increase. First, people were increasingly worried about the potential for diabolic involvement that might curse the marriage. The priest could bless the ring, the couple, and the marriage bed. This, then, could combat any concerns that a third party might curse the couple. Though this was more of a phenomenon in Northern Europe and much, much less around the Mediterranean. The ring, now blessed immediately before it went on the bride's finger, became a symbol of fidelity and even fertility. Now, the second reason that the church becomes increasingly, and specifically the clergy, becomes increasingly involved in marriages is because the church became increasingly insistent that marriages wherein the exact words were not said were not valid. They were null and void. Thus, priests became more involved in the process because the church scared people into thinking that if they did not, then their marriage would not be valid. Essentially, what the church was trying to avoid here are so-called clandestine marriages. Now, what I mean by that are marriages that young couples are engaging in without the permission of one or the other sets of parents. The people who sought out priests did so mostly to ensure that the children of that couple would then have the right to inherit. Now, oddly, in some circumstances, this actually backfired. In Italy, for example, much like Romeo and Juliet, couples who knew that their parents would not consent to the marriage actually just went and sought out a priest on their own who might say the vows. Then, if the priest did his job, the deed was done, and there was nothing that the parents could do about it. Now, the church went to extensive lengths to try to prevent this new kind of clandestine marriage. So as a sort of compromise, by the late Middle Ages, the church agreed that the formal procedure would involve the reading of the 3 banns, the swearing of the marriage oaths before the priest, and 3 witnesses. And the 3 witnesses were there to clearly avoid your Romeo and Juliet situations. Those of you who know your Shakespeare will know they only had 2 witnesses. Bonus points if you can name them. But the idea was, by forcing different witnesses to come, it would be more difficult for people to skirt their parents' desires, which was the whole purpose of this, at least from the standpoint of a lot of individuals. All of this is a pretty big deal because what we see here in the later Middle Ages is a complete transformation of marriage from a social process in which the church guaranteed it to an ecclesiastical process in which the church completely administered it. Hence, by the time we get to the Reformation, the church is completely dominating the field of marriage and is another way that most common Europeans would have had an interaction with the structure of the church. Now, if birth and marriage were major events eventually dominated by the church by the year 1400, certainly someone's death was the church event. Really, the rites associated with death were one of the major resources that the Roman Catholic Church would have against reformers, as we'll see. Even in places like Germany, which are going to be a hotbed of the Reformation, we see the public consistently insisting that the old death rites continue to be performed, whatever the difficulties this might mean for Reformation pastors and theologians. Broadly speaking, the rites of death were practically antisocial, as these were conveyed in the Commentio Animae, bedside prayers, and the burial rite. They deal with a soul radically separated by deathbed confession and last will from all earthly concerns and relationships. The deceased was to be left totally alone with the priest, fortified by prayers and blessings for the dismaying sequence of perils and ordeals which the deceased might have to pass on their way to paradise, or perhaps through purgatory. These deathbed rites inevitably involve the so-called liturgy of the death. Quote, "Out of the depths have I carried thee, O Lord," and, quote, "Go forth on thy journey, Christian soul." Now, once more, I want to remind you, this is not a liturgy that the earliest Christians would have recognized. In fact, this time there's a total break. The earliest Christians believed that the day of judgment was at some unforeseen point in the future. By 1400, the settled theology had changed. Christianity had become medieval. Now theologians taught that the soul was to be judged immediately after death. And that's important because this is how we get to the indulgence movement. Because there would be no point in paying for indulgences for the soul of someone who has yet to be judged. Now, for the individual, death might have been a private event, which I assume it is. I've never died, but I'm going to go ahead and say yes. But it was a very social event for those who remained behind. There were rites of informing the neighborhood, for laying out the body in the house, for watching, also called the wake, mourning, and reading the will, rites for carrying the body to church, rites of the funeral, properly speaking, the office of the dead performed over the body, rites of burial, funeral baked meats, obligations to be fulfilled towards the soul, and even commemorations and anniversaries, both individual and collective. All of these things were part of the social fabric that made up death. And it's again one of those instances where we see the church getting stronger and stronger control over one of the most important events in anyone's life, their death. Now, until the body departed for the churchyard, it remained in the possession of the deceased kin, at least for one night. The domestic ritual of laying out the body, the clipping of the hairs and nails, was done normally by women. Women were also in charge of the formal process of lamentation. These were passionate denunciations and demands for vengeance on anyone who might be held responsible for the death. Now, once the body left the residency, it was bound for the funeral rite. Now, the main attraction of the funeral rite was it would include what's called the Mass for the Dead, and so enabled the bereaved to launch in a decent way the process of fulfilling their obligations to the soul of the departed. The Mass of the Dead is probably the most important aspect of the funeral. It's also the most important tie that the Reformation pastors are going to have a difficult time getting people to give up on. And there's a very simple reason for that. And that's because the Mass for the Dead eventually is said not just for the deceased, and it's not just said once. It's said multiple times, and it's said for everybody. These are prayers that go for the benefit of all deceased and those who have yet to die. I want you to think of it as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. You know, as long as the Mass for the Dead, that wheel is still turning, there's still prayers going up to everybody who has died and everybody who will die. So if you're one of those unfortunate souls, not so unfortunate that you're in hell, but unfortunate enough that you're in purgatory, and if you're not wealthy, if you're not a nobleman, if you can't buy a monastery and have the monks chant for you every single day and for your soul, well, then you're kind of dependent on the collective good. Like I said, it's like an insurance policy that all Western Europeans pay into and that they hope to get something from in the end. While much of this was driven by individual panic and self-regard, we cannot ignore the intense desire of those left behind for their deceased loved ones, and for those loved ones to remain in one way a part of their own kin. This was the other purpose of the Mass for the Dead, and given that most theologians denied the idea that the dead remained linked in any way with their living families, it was a major concession of the Roman Catholic Church, even to allow it to continue to go forward. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. By 1500, there was a really simple chantry in English that required the simple reading of, quote unquote, "May they rest in peace," which concluded the Mass for the Dead. But eventually, what ends up happening here is this gets highly elaborated and a lot more specific to make it clear that we're talking about everybody. So by the mid-16th century, here's what we're talking about instead. We've gone from "May they rest in peace" to, quote, "May the souls of the kings of England, of William Wadpole," who was the founder in this case, his father, his mother, brothers, sisters, wives, blood relations, friends, and benefactors all rest in peace. Amen. Now you can tell by that change that what the people who are paying for here, what they want, is reinsurance by the church that they're going to be connected with their families after death. This is a stance that the church did not approve of, but which it went along with nonetheless. This notion is then also tied to medieval concepts of ghosts. Medieval people felt that ghosts certainly did exist, but not like the ghosts in the movie today. These haunted places, not people, and desired nothing more than the proper funeral rites so that they may, quote unquote, rest in peace. What a ghost normally required was an adequate saying of a number of masses to ensure the salvation of the soul. And hence the indulgence. But before we get there, let's talk about purgatory, because purgatory is absolutely not in the Bible. And you need a purgatory if you are going to sell a way out of purgatory. The concept of purgatory had been slowly creeping up on Western Christendom since the early Middle Ages. It affirmed that, besides the traditional heaven and hell, there was a third region of the other world, an intermediate destination, a waiting room of sorts, where most of those who were ultimately destined for the company of heaven would have, in the meantime, to undergo punishment for their sins. This was the simple application of Anselm's rule of satisfaction. The more convincing as the ancient penitential machinery for enforcing satisfaction in this world had fallen into decay. The definition of the doctrine became steadily more explicit through the councils of Lyon in 1274, Florence in 1439, and then Trent. The Church seems to have been following as determining the simple deductions of simple lay instinct and speculation. Indeed, it was popular culture that put purgatory on the map. It was Dante's Divine Comedy in 1320, which really popularized the idea, not the church. Now, this didn't mean that the average person had a clear view of the kind of place, or rather state, that purgatory was. The idea, not recognized by Dante but favored by the church on quasi-scriptural grounds, that the agent of purgatory was fire, and that purgatory was a sort of cave from which, in the end, souls flew up to heaven. But that didn't seem to actually take a lot of theological traction, at least not until the 15th century. Until then, the common sense view was that the souls of the dead would naturally be more or less where their bodies were, in the churchyard, suffering from the cold and wet, rather than the excessive heat. So the falling back on purgatory as the intermediate destination for the dead made it possible to envisage death as a passage into a collectivity whose location was the churchyard, and which, therefore, possessed its own proper segment of the common territory as the living possessed theirs. The early Christians, conforming to the pattern still expressed in the liturgy, had buried their dead ad sanctus, close to the tombs of the martyrs and outside inhabited places. Consecrated as these were, they were areas of inviolability. Hence, for a long time in the Middle Ages, and this may be a surprise to many of you, the churchyard was a collective place. Individual burial sites were not marked or remembered. Now, during the 15th century, representations of the community of the dead as a model for the community of the living achieved a memorable form in the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of the Death, painted on the cloister wall of a number of celebrated churchyards, notably in Paris. This portrays a circle where the dead alternate holding hands with the living and lead them in a dance around the graves. The skeletal dead, an undifferentiated community of equals, dance keenly, the living reluctantly, weighed down by robes, possessions, and thoughts about status. They have to be dragged in by the dead, polite but firm. Hence, more than anything else, the dance of death illustrates how, in the 15th century, the grave was never a private place at all. It was a public place, an embracing of sort of compulsory, the understanding that we were all going to die. But coming back for a moment to the mechanisms of the death and the relationship of Europeans to the church, by the 15th century, it was very likely that the business of carrying the body to the church, of seeing to its burial, even of watching by the body in the house, was in the hands of a parish fraternity dedicated to charitable purposes. This was followed by what's called the Truce of Death, since the confession and, if relevant, will of the dying had to include a granting of forgiveness to offenders and a seeking for forgiveness for offenses. It was possible for those at enmity with the dying to appear at the deathbed and burial rites. The stereotype of the deathbed reconciliation, it turns out, is actually more than just a cliche. There was also the rule, widely observed later, that the nuntius mortis, the person who would go round to give the formal notice of the death, must not be related to or even friends with the dead person. Such obligatory togetherness has ended, in modern times, with the funeral feast after the burial. It existed also in the general feast after the All Souls, which is one of the great festivals of the traditional Christian church. Now, this all leads to the widespread concern about prayers for lost souls during the Middle Ages, by which I mean souls who did not receive sufficient prayers to get out of purgatory. Again and again, the church reminded its people of, quote, all the faithful departed, end quote, of those with no one to pray for them, all those buried in the churchyard, all the souls of the parish. On the Virgil of All Souls in the 15th century, the church bells rang through the night. German children, for example, lit candles and laid cakes on the graves, or lit bonfires in the churchyard. All these were ways of making sure that the souls of the departed remained, in some fashion, connected with their families and still alive. All Souls' Day eventually did turn into Halloween. There is some evidence that the church reminded parishioners to feed the living poor on the same night. Hence, the idea, still present today, of giving out food during Halloween. Regardless, the rites of death remained one of the most difficult aspects of medieval theology for reformers to combat during the Reformation. I can see how. If you believed that following those specific rites kept you out of hell or purgatory, then why risk changing? Whether we are talking about birth, death, or marriage, each of life's major milestones was dominated by the church in the late Middle Ages. Roman Catholic Church dominated the major milestones of life, to be sure, but it also completely controlled people's conception of morality, and this would ultimately be one of the major changes to come about during the Reformation. However, for Roman Catholic Europeans in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the concepts and ideas of sin and penance were well-established truths. The principal vehicle of the moral tradition of the West was the doctrine of the 7 deadly sins: pride, anger, envy, avarice, gluttony, sloth, and lechery, more or less in that order. Once more, I want to remind everybody that there is no list of 7 deadly sins in either the New or Old Testament. Hence, what we are dealing with here, again, is a purely medieval invention. In terms of the 7 deadly sins, theologians drew a distinction between sins of the spirit and of the flesh. Diseases of the spirit were to be avoided more strenuously than those of the flesh. The sins of the spirit were pride, envy, and anger. Gluttony, lechery, and sloth were sins of the flesh, and avarice just had this tendency to float back and forth between the two categories for much of the Middle Ages. The 7 deadly sins were a system of community ethics, by which I mean that they existed to ensure a well-functioning society. It was a system very similar to how Sharia law is interpreted in many Islamic countries today, a purely moral system designed to get people, in theory, from fighting with each other or angering an almighty God. This community ethic was consistently expounded in the Lenten sermons of pre-Reformation parsons, friars, and cathedral preachers. To get a sense of what I mean, you need look no further than the Parson's Tale in the Canterbury Tales written by Chaucer between 1387 and 1400. Though, of course, Dante famously deals with each sin in his Divine Comedy. Both men list the 3 most damaging sins as pride, envy, and wrath, which is anger. Envy had 2 branches: jealousy in other men's prosperity and pleasure in their misfortune. Envy is crucially tied into the medieval concept known as the limited good. This is another one of those medieval ideas that is slowly but surely going to get ground away during the Reformation. But it's important to know about it now because it'll be something that Reformation theologians come back to, and so I'm going to reference it. Now, specifically, medieval people were taught that each community has only a limited amount of good, so good things that can happen. Hence, if someone has an abundant harvest, then that means someone else's harvest has to fail. Thus, envy was the worst sin because it meant seeing fault in God's divine balancing act. It's very important to remember this concept of almost a spiritual piggy bank, because it is another reason for 2 key battles in the Reformation that are going to come down the road. The first is the indulgence system, which I referenced several times already, but which is tied into the system of limited good, wherein one can buy more spiritual good. The second is the distinction between faith and faith alone and faith plus good works. Tied up in the idea of the limited good is the notion for medieval people that you needed to try to add to the piggy bank. You needed to try to add to this well of good. You did this through good works, most notably friendship. And that would be one of the major theological battlegrounds of the Reformation that's coming. Now, wrath, on the other hand, isn't what we think of today. Wrath did not mean uncontrolled, passionate anger towards someone. Rather, wrath was a settled and formal hatred toward a neighbor, something that inspired small acts of malice against him, not outright passionate murder. Wrath was counterbalanced by friendship and love. And don't forget, by the way, each of these 7 deadly sins has its counterpart in a virtue. Friendship and love could add to the total amount of good in the community. Friendship, and specifically love of one's enemies, was the supreme Christian virtue, precisely because Christ died for his enemies. Now, in contrast, the sins of gluttony, lechery, and sloth were considered trivial by comparison to the sins of the spirit. Lechery, in the medieval sense, is a little hard for us to wrap our modern minds around, because lechery referred to literally all sexual acts. By that I mean even sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife is technically a sin. That sin, however, gets purified through childbirth. Still, the overall idea to take away here is that in the medieval world, sexual acts were considered intrinsically shameful. This is, of course, one of the big breaks with the classical world in late antiquity. The reason to avoid lechery, though, was not because of the obvious damage of what it might do to the social structure, but because of the chance that you might bring down the wrath of God. Now, to combat these sins, friendship and charity were what mattered. Charity and friendship needed to outweigh the sins of the flesh and the sins of the spirit in order for society to function properly. And again, that's where we kind of get into this idea of the divine balancing act. And we've seen this a couple of times, if you remember sort of the episodes on the bubonic plague. There's the idea that too much community sin, too much collective sin is going to bring down the wrath of God. So the way that you balance that out in the medieval world is by friendship and good works. Now, in the latter half of the 15th century, we see the 7 deadly sins start to lose some prominence, though they do not disappear completely. Preachers begin to grow restless that the 7 deadly sins do not give the sins of the flesh sufficient weight. And so they start casting about for another moral code. Fortunately for them, turns out there was a much older moral code, and this one is actually in the Bible, the 10 Commandments. Hence, in some places by the Reformation, the 10 Commandments had begun to replace the 7 deadly sins as the supreme moral compass of the West. To a large extent, this change actually reflects a larger trend of secularization in Europe. Increasingly in the 15th century, the type of dispute that the church courts were asked to arbitrate was changing. More and more, these courts dealt with adultery, rape, and prostitution, 3 offenses that related to marriage, an institution which, as we just talked about, the church was gaining more and more control over. Prior offenses were more between 2 families, or between 1 person and a community. Throughout Europe, this more private way of dealing with retaliation and the regulation of offenses changed and became the purview of the secular ruler and the state. The Catholic Church, once the most important institution for the maintenance of peace in Europe, began to drift to the periphery. Overall, by 1600, the concept of peace as tranquility as opposed to peace as reconciliation had forced the church to abandon some of its long-held practices. And so, because the church doesn't have ultimate control anymore over some of the more bedrock principles of European society, that is, war and peace and settlements of large disputes, what begins to happen in the 16th and especially 17th century is that sexuality becomes increasingly the central matter of Catholic ethics. The 7 deadly sins, and especially those sins of the spirit, envy, pride, wrath, start to get pushed more and more off to the side. And this is one of the big transitions that we'll come back to between the 14th and 17th centuries. And it's going to be at the heart. And these ideas, by the way, even though they do affect everyday people, these are ideas that the big theologians are going to argue about. When we come back to Martin Luther, John Calvin, these are the types of ideas that these guys are going to be talking about. And that's why you need to understand, as we start to transition out of the late Middle Ages, that these concepts are already starting to buckle a little bit. But we've now have to talk about the most important Christian season of the year, Lent and the Carnival, the short season that was its opposite and came before it. Lent in the Middle Ages is all about community ethics. The idea behind Lent was to have a period of penance from the public at large to pay for the sins of the year. So if Lent was about paying the tab, then Carnival was about racking it up. By the 16th century, Carnival was in full swing. However, we see little evidence to support its existence prior to the 13th century. Hence, most historians today believe that Carnival was mostly a high and late Middle Ages phenomenon. And Carnival and Lent form the opposite sides of the same coin. Carnival actually occurred in the Middle Ages about when it does today, a series of 3 to 6 days of feasting, ending on Shrove Tuesday or Mardi Gras. These were formal feasting days, during which work was prohibited. Carnival was not the carefree event that we tend to picture today. Part of Carnival in the Middle Ages was both symbolic and often very real acts of violence. Now keep in mind that Lent is about penance, and so Carnival is about sinning. And it seems that people took that idea seriously, and that authorized violence was fairly common. Even soccer, football if you're not in the United States, seems to draw its origins from Carnival. What's really interesting about Carnival is how regional it was. By and large, most of the things that we've talked about in this episode were European-wide phenomenon. However, Carnival caught on like crazy in places like Italy and Spain and most of France, plus a few parts of Germany. But in the Low Countries, England, and Scandinavia, we don't see it at all. And we still see that today, where some cultures who participated in Mardi Gras in the Middle Ages exported those customs to the New World, while those who did not participate did not do the same. While the remission of sin was in the textbooks the effect of a threefold action of contrition, confession, and satisfaction performed in private between an individual sinner and an individual priest, in practice it was actually governed by an unwritten tradition that sin is totally visible and is a completely social matter, to be redeemed by acts as visible and social as the Passion of the Christ. And not that there was any shortage of contrition, rather the reverse. Throughout the Middle Ages, the spontaneous expression of penance largely overflowed the sacramental channel provided to contain it. Public penance was visibly present in the operation of the church courts, whose business was to deal with public sin and public reconciliation. And though their fees were unpopular and their activities tending to restrict the matrimonial questions, their operations always attracted a wide degree of general support. And that's an idea that's really important to remember, because you do tend to see a lot of stuff in some of the larger historical textbooks when you get to the Reformation, that there's this sort of widespread rejection of the church courts, that the church courts are corrupt, and that's one of the key impetuses for the Reformation. But it's important to remember that while there might have been a lot of individual criticisms of specific cases and specific parts of the church courts, in general, those courts continued to be widely supported and popular throughout Europe, even up to the eve of the Reformation. Since the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the people of Christendom had been required to publicly acknowledge their sins every Easter before the service. Medieval Europeans literally could not come into the church if they did not acknowledge their sins. By the 15th century, basically everyone was doing it, save a few holdouts. Besides Easter, the most important moment in a person's life which related to sin and penance was, of course, the deathbed confession. The crucial matter of the deathbed confession was the seeking and giving of pardon for offenses. And this is absolutely borne out in the evidence. In Paris, as late as the middle of the 17th century, 57.5% of wills required heirs of the dying to make reparation for their offenses, while 42.4% of the same granted pardon for offenses committed by others against them. Confession and restitution were for the dying an essential incident in the passage of the Christian into the kingdom of heaven. Those who could not fulfill the obligation of annual confession most often did so because they were in a state of hostility with their neighbor. This was rare, however, because remember that sin is considered to be communal. States of offense, therefore, existed in the community as a whole. What this does then is increase the pressure on everyone to confess their sins and also tattle on their neighbors. Actual absolution for sin followed a very specific ritual. The priest, upon hearing the confession, would place his hand on the penitent's forehead and formally restore the person to the social communion of the church. Absolution, of course, was then contingent on the penitent's performing visible acts of reparation for sin. According to the theologians, restitution did not figure as a part of the sacramental sequence, but without it, as without laying aside of enmity, the process of reconciliation with God just simply couldn't happen. This wasn't always an easy thing to be borne out. Take the following example. A wife confesses an adulterous relationship from which a child has been born and understood by her husband to be his own. Now, the absolution of the woman for her sin is one thing, but the calculation of the social consequences in this case is totally different. In fulfillment of his responsibility for the exterior maintenance of the marriage alliance, and not to mention the prevention of what might be a literal war between families, which was an absolutely foreseeable chain of murders, the priest would almost always advise and instruct the wife that she might not relieve her conscience by telling her husband. In other words, the priest might tell the wife to continue to lie. So, retribution in this case for the sins would not include being honest about the sins. Sometimes, in order to maintain the social fabric in medieval Europe, a priest had to be both moral counselor and diplomat. It seems likely that the profusion of preaching manuals on confession, especially after the invention of printing, reinforced a growing trend toward privacy when it came to confessing one's sins. Now, at the same time, throughout the 15th century, the age at which one was expected to begin confession began to creep downward. Circa 1400, that age was 14 years old, but by the turn of the 16th century, that number had been halved, and 7-year-olds were now expected to confess their sins. Tied to this shift was the idea of a regular and systematic confession. Throughout the 15th century, the idea that one should confess their sins regularly was an idea that, increasingly, was proposed to the laity of Europe, and it was something which, by and large, was quickly accepted and adopted as the norm. Alongside these changes that increased the amount of confessing in Europe was a change to the methods of satisfaction. The early medieval church tended to be much harsher than the late medieval church. Specifically, by the late Middle Ages, one could make satisfaction for their sins after confession by a modest regimen of prayer and, crucially, you guessed it, almsgiving, i.e., a cash payment. In fact, by the 15th century, satisfaction had become largely symbolic. Few undertook a major pilgrimage anymore. No one walked around barefoot in the snow. You said a few prayers, threw a few coins in the coffer, and you were back in the fold. The exception to this general trend, of course, remained Lent, the period of public satisfaction. Christians in Europe, even on the eve of the Reformation, still thought that real suffering bought you more forgiveness. The time for this collective suffering was Lent. Hence why, even on the eve of the Reformation, why Lent and Easter remained the crucial church seasons of the year. Essentially, while in the long run, Martin Luther's preaching would reduce the pressure on the faithful to pacify God through penitential acts, in the short run, his stance had the opposite effect. Catholics in some more religious parts of England could still be found, circa 1700, up to their necks in icy water to provide satisfaction, at the demand of conservative clergy, of course. So with satisfaction, we finally come face to face with what we've danced around the entire episode, the indulgence system. You probably already know that the indulgence system was one of the driving forces behind Luther's demand for reform. Questions about indulgence and the indulgence system were essentially questions about the concept of satisfaction. The institution had its origins in the earlier regime of public penance, and the term applied to the remission, diminution, or conversion of penal satisfaction imposed on the sinner in the course of his readmission to the community of the church. It represented charity in the courts of penitential justice, and it continued to represent it after the system of public penance had gone away. By 1400, a couple of other things had happened to the indulgence system. It had been attached to a variety of works, of which the most important, of course, was the Crusade, but including public improvements like bridge building or church building, and it had been established that these works could be performed by proxy or commuted for money. We've already talked in other episodes about how the indulgence system starts to come about during the Crusades, both as a means for paying for one's sin by going on crusade, but then critically also getting rid of your sin by paying for a crusade. The idea in itself was a reasonable deduction from a feature of the early medieval penitential system, which St. Anselm had evoked in his doctrine of redemption. Satisfactory penance due from one person could be made by another, provided that the relation between the two parties was sufficiently intimate and close, and that what was done by one of them could be taken by God and the Church as being done by the other. This is that idea we talked about before of transferable merit, which stretches all the way back to the sufferings of Christ, which were sufficient to make up for any possible amount of satisfaction which the sins of Christians might require. Now, the second part is more disputed, for the doctrine of vicarious satisfaction seemed to imply that the transfer of merit could only be effective where there was a particular relation of charity or kinship. But nobody could really argue with the first part, that you could transfer merit. That was established, again, through medieval theology. It's not in the Bible, but it was established through medieval theology that you could transfer your charity and your merit back and forth. The popes from 1300 onward had no doubt that their power as custodians of the treasury of the church, and I'm talking about moral treasury at this point, extended to the ability to get people out of purgatory. Now, it was therefore their duty, as well as their pleasure, to add indulgence to the existing modes of prayer and sacrifice, by which the living perform their obligations to the souls of the dead. This starts to become actual dogma in 1476, when Pope Sixtus IV granted a model indulgence for anybody willing to contribute to the rebuilding of the Church of Sens in western France, and of absolute remission therefrom for the pains of purgatory to the kindred and friends of anybody suffering there. Hence, pay money for the rebuilding of this church, and anybody you know gets a free pass out of purgatory. Not a bad deal, all in all. And this grant in 1476 would serve as the model for all kinds of different indulgences over the next century and a half. The concept of fraternity, that is friendship between people, or in other words, societal peace, was one of the key tenets of late medieval Christianity. The state of charity, meaning social integration, was the principal end and goal of every Christian's life. Anyone who claimed to be a Christian had to exemplify charity at some point in their life. The simplest form of charity was actually just a salutation or a greeting. You could show charity to your fellow man by being welcoming and kind. The institution that most spontaneously embodied this frame of mind in medieval Europe was the fraternity. Fraternities, the most characteristic expression of late medieval Christianity, are kind of regarded as substitute kindreds for those who didn't possess natural ones, but they were clearly more than something like this. One writer said, quote, "They satisfied an appetite for association beyond economic means and beyond the circle of the kin. At best, these embodied sacred Christian kinship, as opposed to profane consanguinity. Also, in principle, they were more than purely God-parenthood, since they represented confraternity without compaternity. Indeed, there was no actual paternity or relation in any sense, including that of lordship. This was a totally egalitarian situation. There weren't anyone who was greater or anyone who was lesser in institutional fraternity. Institutional fraternity was not an invention of the century or two preceding the Reformation, and contrary to what some believe, it was not a response to the Black Death, or to the political or economic difficulties of the age. I'm guessing the plague probably gave it a new impetus, a new life, but it did not create the idea of the fraternity. Fraternities in many cases were of course tied to the local guild, and so they were based off a profession. For a modest entry fee, you could get in. And like the trade guilds, fraternities were great inventors of ritual. The ritual of entry into brotherhood or sisterhood involved an oath, or more appropriately, the kiss of peace. In a London guild, quote, "Every brother and sister, in tokening of love and charity and peace, at receiving shall kiss other of them that had been there," end quote. The rituals of participation and greeting were meeting and eating. The purpose of the meeting, normally 4 times a year, including one main annual meeting, wasn't simply to elect officers, admit new members, and demonstrate status, but to literally get together, to intercommune. And there were fines for absence and strict regulations against noisy, lewd, or offensive words or behavior. And this was followed by the fraternity feast. So again, this is one of those examples, the fraternity is, of the reality of religion. And that's what I keep coming back to throughout this episode. The reality of Christianity for common people in Europe. Medieval religion really did motivate, and it motivated individuals to do things on a real and practical basis. That's why the Reformation that's coming down the pipeline here is going to hit with such a shock. An even greater shock for most Europeans than the discovery of 2 whole new continents over to the west. Now, the key characteristic of the Christian relationship was peace. Peace then equaled friendship. Friendship through Christian bonds prevented the feud. In fact, fraternities were created in part in northern Italy as a way to secure peace in the streets between feuding pro-papal and pro-Holy Roman Emperor sects. Invoking Christian peace as a means of restoring order was not the only means of doing so in the medieval world, but it was certainly one of the more effective. Moreover, the obligation of peace also prevented fraternity members from suing one another in an effort to force the parties to find amicable solutions. Nor was this the only social benefit the fraternities offered. Those who fell into poverty could be assisted by the fraternity. Some guilds provided interest-free loans to members, or, often in the countryside, free lending of food. Charity also meant concern for the welfare of the dead. In Northern Europe especially, it was common for fraternities to hire chaplains to say prayers for the dead. And these attitudes persisted right up to the Reformation. Even in the early 16th century, fraternities took the obligation of Christian brotherhood extremely seriously. Some even took this obligation and expanded it to the public at large. I want to stress, however, that this wasn't common. and most fraternities continue to practice charity only as an obligation between members. Of course, as I've mentioned multiple times already, the clergy were a part of the community, and disputes between members of the clergy and the rest of the lay population were common. Then again, disputes between everybody was common, and priests who were more or less on a level with their flocks were just more likely to get involved in them than at a graduate or seminary-trained clergy of a later age. Hostility between priests and members of their flock was both a fact of life and just a cliché of later books, and most of our knowledge of the pre-Reformation clergy is derived from the complaints of parishioners at episcopal visitations. So it's hard to know whether the incidence of bad feelings between clergy and parishes was greater than between people in general, but we have to remember that the clergy had complicated relationships with those that they worked with, including elements that were financial, sexual, ritual, legal, social, and psychological. And this forms a particularly powerful powder keg. Problems with the tithe and similar financial issues were likely to provoke lawsuits. These hostilities almost inevitably led to charges against a priest's chastity. Priests, since the 11th century, had to be celibate. By the 16th century, this was generally followed, and during the Reformation, it was a practice that was codified in an effort to make the Catholic purity a benchmark. That being said, most parish priests seem to have done a good job. Since parishes were rarely backward in coming forward with charges against their priests, it seems just reasonable to assume that in the majority of cases where we see silence, the priest was doing his job with fair conscientiousness, sensitivity, and just common sense. And I don't want to dissuade you for a second. This was a huge feat because the hub of Christian society was the priest, and he had functions to perform which might seem just inherently contradictory. He had, at least in the North, to serve the separate families at baptisms, marriages, and deathbeds, families that would have hated each other. He had to keep his finger on their kin relationships, their dowries, their wills and burials. He had to say mass for their living and dead. He had to defend their person, offsprings, and possessions. Yet at the same time, and for the sake of the parish as a whole, to criticize their misdeeds and avoid espousing their quarrels. Whether at confession or informally throughout the year, it was the priest's business to try to get reconciliation of enemies as often as he could. Now, obviously, when it comes to seeing your parishioners, the parish mass was the quintessential time when a parish priest saw and shepherded his flock. Much will be made during the Reformation of a supposed goal of the Catholic Church to keep the peasants in the dark about the Mass, especially as much of it was said in Latin. And much would be made by later historians, most of them contemporaries and many of them Protestant, about the debilitating impact that this had on society as a whole. But there were reasons to wonder if this was all gloom and doom as it was made out to be. We don't have to presuppose that congregations were totally ignorant of what the priest was doing at the altar, if only because his performance actually is the subject of frequent criticism that we read about in the historical texts. If the peasants didn't know what he was doing, how could they criticize him? The average parishioner, who probably would not be up to that, probably knew what he needed to know. He knew that the priest was making a sacrifice and satisfaction for the living and the dead. He knew that he would make God actually present in the host before consuming it. If he wasn't a heretic, he knew that this extraordinary event represented the best thing that could have ever happened in the universe. If he could say his Pater Noster and had been to confession and communion, he knew that these effects were something to do with the painful tasks of repenting your sins and loving your neighbor. Now, just kind of looking at a Mass in general, a Mass in the late Middle Ages would begin with offertory prayers for the bread and wine, and then vernacular prayers for spiritual and temporal authorities, the fruits of the earth, the conditions of men, friends, allies, enemies, blah, blah, blah. The dead, by the 15th century, were certainly taking an increasing role in these prayers but that does not mean that the living were wholly forgotten. In short, until this point in Mass, the parish was being itself. It was just participating and uniting the living and the dead with the act of sacrifice and the text of the Mass required. But except for the unusually devout, who might be praying in the corners, hardly undergoing an experience of the holy. The transformation probably began with a sermon, which would usually occur at the point after the major prayers, if there was one. But normally it came when the bell rang, and Sanctus launched the priest and congregation into the silence of the canon, or, as the Germans called it, the Stillmess. At this point in the service, people would kneel. The church did not encourage them to know exactly what the priest was saying, on the grounds that if they did, they might use these powerful words for conjuring and malice, and giving the overall superstition of Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries. I can't say that I blame them. But as the priest's arms moved, they knew he was preparing to make God present, as they would verify when the bell rang again. They would lift their heads up and see the host held high above them. Now, while the common people most certainly didn't understand or could not explain the distinction between sacrifice and sacrament, no doubt everybody present in the church understood the transition after the communion. Now came the point of the Mass when many people actually left. But it wasn't out of some medieval sense of boredom or anything like that. That was because at this point in the Mass, after the communion, it was time for the kiss of peace. Men to men, women to women, according to the rules. But some people were not prepared to offer a kiss of peace to their neighbors, with whom they might very well be in a state of conflict. So, simply to avoid a forced reconciliation, these people, after the communion, just kind of ducked out the back. By the 13th century, most people would actually kiss a representation of Jesus, called the pax, Latin for peace, and not one another. By the time that the pax had made its way around the church, the priest would be telling everybody that the Mass had ended, that they could return home. It was actually at the start of the Middle Ages that the church moved the kiss of peace from the beginning of the Mass to the end, illustrating its key importance in the Western world. One of the key changes reformers wanted was in the Eucharist. The people would see the blessing of the wafer, but would, with the exception of Easter, probably not get to consume it. Only the priest ate the body of Christ. But there is a contrary argument here. If communion was only taken, not observed, by everyone, only once, perhaps twice, some communities added Christmas or Pentecost, every year, then it became a much more solemn occasion. Communion had to be prepared for by fasting and the forgiveness of sin. It wasn't the sort of thing, in the Middle Ages at least, that one just kind of did. The communion also called for an additional offering, usually a penny in England, by way of comparison. Hence, in the eyes of some parishioners, the fact that communion only transpired one time per year probably wasn't a negative thing at all. Now, the salvation spoken of during the Mass was literally the deliverance of evils of this world and the everlasting beauty in the next. For many ordinary people, salvation was the matter of the everlasting soul. Nothing less, nothing more. It was the whole point of everything. The purpose of the Mass and of the constant observation of the sacraments, especially confession, was to save your soul from the torments of hell in the event of sudden death, something that everybody in medieval Europe feared. And again, another example of just how real religion was to everybody in medieval Europe. Christianity was a thing that touched them all more than any other institution in the medieval world. Now, medieval Europeans were concerned about more than just their souls, however. Several superstitions grew up during the Middle Ages that illustrated what some people actually believed. For example, some people believed that the power of the Eucharist meant that time itself stood still during Mass, and that you did not grow older while in church. Another example related to the baptism. People believed that holy water and the cross literally exorcised very real demons at baptism, and that the same holy water and cross might be used in time of danger in everyday life. The last thing we're going to talk about in this episode is how Christians in the late Middle Ages perceived non-Christians, namely Jews and Muslims. The tradition of the Crusade might have ended in the late Middle Ages, but from a public standpoint, Islam remained the prime enemy of Christendom, and emperors and popes regularly reminded people of it. But for all that, the relations of Catholics with various different Islamic groups, Moors in Spain, for example, rarely attained the degree of passion which attended other peoples, and this requires some explanation. And one of the reasons that I'm talking about this is because what we're getting into are two huge periods of othering. For one, this is the age of the Spanish Inquisition and the Inquisition in general. And so people are looking for heretics all over the place, which leads to, you guessed it, another bout of anti-Semitism. But the other aspect is we're getting into the period of medieval history, early modern history, when witches become a big deal for the first time. Now, turning to the Jews of Europe for a moment, what was lacking with Muslims, almost as much as with Mongols or even the far-off Chinese, was a recognition of the self and the other. You can't other someone otherwise. Jews were usurers. From St. Ambrose on, the church had preached that it was against the laws of God to take interest from fellow Christians. Now, that being said, of course, by 1400, all the major banking houses charged interest, just in unique ways. But nevertheless, this meant that the church needed a new prime enemy, and around the 15th century they found one in the witch. By this time, the witch had certainly replaced the usurer as the embodiment of malice. And it's hard to know exactly, based off the evidence, how much of this had gone on before the 16th century, but certainly by then, witches had turned into suspect number one. Witches, if their wrath was aroused and their technique successful, could afflict one's body or children. They killed swine, spread sickness among cattle, and turned their milk into blood. They smote one's sexual organs with impotence and brought down storms to ruin crops. Occasionally, less in everyday life than in the stress of high political conflict, they were persecuted unto death. And simple misogyny isn't quite enough in this case to explain why most witches were thought to be women. Women, generally, if old, unmarried, and unfriended, were like monks who resorted to exceptional methods in the pursuit of their quarrels because their callings forbade them to use conventional ones, became vessels of resentment. Male witches were frequently, and for the same reason, members of the clergy. Where a man would proceed by fire and sword, witches proceeded by sickness and evil weather. They were in all things the opposite. Interestingly, whether you lived in rural England or the Italian cities, the European witch of the late Middle Ages occupied the same stereotype. This was tied into the conviction, sharpening by 1500, that witches were part of the army of Satan, intent on overthrowing all of Christendom. Witches formed sects, all of which were supposed to be trying to destroy God. Witches were normally, in the late Middle Ages, not persecuted as witches per se, but as idolaters, because they worshipped something other than God, i.e. the devil. That meant that you could prosecute them as violating the first commandment, which made them enemy number one. Witches, by the way, were hanged, not burnt at the stake. Still, even more than witches, the unquestionable enemy of the human race throughout the Middle Ages remained the Jews. The Jews, and this is critical in medieval Europe, were not considered to be a class, but a people. And if they were often engaged in money lending and tax collection among Christians, this was just a self-fulfilling effect of all the previous antagonism of centuries before. The Jews were, plain and simple, the original enemies of Christ, who had procured his crucifixion and death, and taken his blood upon their heads and those of their children. Nothing was easier for the average Christian to understand than that this was a crime which cried out for vengeance, and, because they were kin, was passed down from generation to generation. From the 14th century on, preachers and friars launched a relentless campaign to have the Jews systematically segregated from wider populations in many areas of Europe, and they were very successful. The Jews, these preachers screamed, were the enemies of Christ and all Christians. Now, unlike witches, there was no biblical justification for just outright killing them. That being said, many people believed that if you could not kill the Jews, you could at the very least burn their homes and property to the ground. And if the Jews were not expelled from Christian lands, then they could be enslaved. The 13th and 14th centuries were some of the worst on record for European Jews, until the 20th, of course. Jews were systematically expelled from different kingdoms, first France, then England, then finally Spain. They were allowed back, of course, since these same kings and queens that threw them out still needed their money. But the lives of all these people were balanced on the edge of a knife, and there was very, very little that they could do about it. So now we've covered the basic church structure and the key doctrinal issues that common people encountered in the late Middle Ages. That should give us some sense about what is going to change as the Reformation breaks. But we're not there yet. On January 15th, I'll release the next episode due to the length of this one. Then we're going to cover the history of the church in Europe from roughly the fall of the Western Roman Empire to 1309, the day the Avignon papacy begins. Then we'll cover said Avignon papacy before moving on to the Renaissance popes, which means the most famous of all popes, the Borgia popes, everyone's favorite. Now, in the meantime, if you want more content, check out the website, westernsibpodcast.com, or consider becoming a patron. For only $2 to $5 per month, you can support the show, get every episode early, and get access to deep dive episodes. I have coverage of the Hussites if you want an early peek at some efforts at popular religious reform. There's a whole series on Western thought, all the Alexander the Great episodes, a history of Greece, you name it. I think we're nearing 100 hours of bonus content at this point, about another 3 to 5 each month. Check it out. And if you want something totally different, and these are both for patrons, and then there's some that are public, you can check out new historical walking tours. If you want more than just audio and you want to go to a historical place, I've got some up. One on the Alamo is available on YouTube. Link in the show notes. It's different. Should be fun. See you in 2 weeks.